Hello everyone, Inquisitor Vaughn here, and in today's video we are going to continue in our deep dive of the Necron Xenos faction for Warhammer 40k. Admittedly, this was supposed to be a two-part series, but there's just so much information and so much to clarify that this series is likely going to be a three-part series, with the next video being about the Necron dynasties. In this video, we're going to go over some of the information that we went over in the first video, just speculate a little bit more, clarify a little bit more, and then address a few other topics that I didn't really talk about in the first video. So if you have not seen the first video, I highly recommend that you do, because in that video, I use a lot of theories that I'm going to be using as foundations in this video. So I highly recommend it. But if you don't want to, it's all good. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what I talked about in the last video, and then you can make a decision as to whether or not you want to watch it. In the first video, we go over a lot of the aspects of Necron culture and organization, including the Necron homeworld. We go over the fact that all Necron came into existence on a single planet in the Halo stars, meaning the stars at the edge of the galaxy to the north, and not the area indicated on Imperial maps as the Halo stars. We speculate that the Necrons did not always have short lives, but that the conditions on their homeworld changed drastically to the point where their star's rays became fatal to them and they couldn't do anything about it. We go over that it is the conditions on their homeworld which pushed them to advance technologically to the point where they were able to leave their homeworld on ships of Necrodermis. We go over the fact that the Necron created Necrodermis on their homeworld and used this living metal to craft starships on which they were able to leave their homeworld. We speculate that they didn't all leave the world, and that it likely remained a seat of power for the Triarch and the nobles of various dynasties, even as the majority of their numbers spread throughout the galaxy in search of new worlds. And we speculate this based on what happened after the Necron started the war with the old ones. They were beaten back to their homeworld. Two things to add about the information on the technological advancement of the Necron. They did not only create Necrodermis, but they also created stasis crypts as well. And they also, according to where you look for the information, according to where you find the information, try to modify themselves in order to adapt and be able to live on the world, but they couldn't. So not only did they create Necrodermis, but they created stasis crypts, and they tried to modify themselves in order to survive, but they could not. And so this is what kind of pushed them to look outward and expand outward. The Necron were a technologically advanced species, and they were forced to do that because of their environment. We go over the dynastic organization of the Necron, how hierarchy was based on rank, status, bloodline, and even physiology. We go over how the Necron units in 40k didn't all exist when the species was still the Necron or still flesh and blood, and how units like the Outcasts were created later in their history after biotransference, but as a result of the emotions experienced by the Necron and the destruction or turning into shards of the Satan. We go over the nature of the Satan, how the beings that the Necron called the Satan were cosmic energy feeders that came into existence the moment the galaxy was created. We go over how the Necron at one point worshipped many gods and had their own pantheon. We make the distinction that the Satan were not the Necron gods, but when the Necron created bodies of Necrodermis for the Satan, they created them in the image of their old gods. Hence the confusion that most people have between the old gods and the Satan. Like a spirit possessing a body, the Satan inhabited these Necrodermis bodies made in the image of the old Necron gods, like Azagorod the Nightbringer and Mephitran the Messenger. And it's through these bodies that they began to interact with the physical universe in a way that they could not before. We go over that the Necron are the reason why countless species would know their old gods, the image of Azagorod being the image of death or the Grim Reaper. And we go over so much more. So if you haven't watched that video, like I said, I encourage you to. But as I said earlier, you don't have to. I just will be using a lot of theories as foundations for this video that I established in the last video. So if you're interested in seeing how we come to these conclusions, definitely watch that video. If not, let's get into this video. So like in my first video, I'm going to go over the points I'm going to be talking about in this video at the beginning, just to manage expectations and so that you know what we're going to be talking about in this video. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the Necron tier timeline, their perception of time and how certain things might be possible. And there's a lot to go into that. Basically, it will be like a clarification of some of the information that we talked about in the first video. All right, so after that, we're going to talk about the Necron tier armor and weaponry, just going a little bit more into the detail of that. We're going to go into the old ones, right? So the old ones were the species that the Necron tier fought during the war in heaven. And so I didn't go over them in the last video. I'm going to go a little bit deeper into them in this video. And then after that, I'm going to go over the old gods of the Necron tier and the Satan. There's a point of irony in this. I know we talked about it a lot in the last video, but I just wanted to answer a question that I had in that last video in this video. And then after that, we're going to go over the cryptex and just how powerful they are and just emphasizing how powerful they are. And last but not least, we're going to go over the ill fate of the Necron tier. Okay, so without further delay, let's get into it. So when attempting to understand the history of the Necron tier and the Necrons, I divide the Necron tier history into certain points, and these points are marked by events that happened in their history, right? So the first part is the homeworld, where they are on their homeworld, trying to figure out a way of escaping. And then after that is the expansion, where the Necron dynasties expand into the Milky Way galaxy and find new worlds to inhabit. Then after that comes the first wars of succession, where the Necron tier began fighting each other over the rule of the Triarch. And then after that is the first war with the Old Ones. This is when the Silent King at the time declared war on the Old Ones. And then after that, we have the second Wars of Succession. This happened after the Necron tier were beaten back to their homeworld. The Necron tier were trapped on their homeworld for thousands of years, and they began to fight each other again. And then we have the War in Heaven. Now, the War in Heaven could also be called the Second War with the Old Ones, but it already has its own name. It's the War in Heaven. This began with the process of biotransference and the introduction of the Satan into the Necron tier narrative. And then after that is a period called the Enslavement. This is when the Necrons turned against the Satan and enslaved the Satan. And then after that is the Great Sleep. And the reason that I want to divide Necron tier history into those sections is because while doing research about the Necron tier history and timeline, it's interesting to find that there are characters who still remember being Necron tier flesh and blood creatures. Either it was during the expansion or during the first Wars of Succession or even in the War in Heaven. And so these characters remember being flesh and blood creatures. And my question is, how is that possible? Right? Now, we can automatically assume that because the Necron tier did not live long lives, this affected their sense of time. So they probably didn't look at time like how we do because their lives were so short, meaning that their perception of time might even be abbreviated, right? A day for us might be 2 days for them, or so on, right? But still, how is it possible that a Necron tier who was born during the expansion or during the first Wars of Succession can remember the first war with the Old Ones or the expansion itself? How is it possible that that is possible if the Necron tier had short lives, right? So I came up with 3 areas of speculation that might explain how this is the case. These 3 speculations build on top of each other. and they serve as an explanation of how this makes sense, right? So the first one is called the departure. It's that leaving their homeworld had a positive effect on the length of their lives, not making their lives any longer, but also not cutting them any shorter. So the Necrontyr were able to live a little bit longer when they escaped the rays of their dying sun. Right. The second theory or point of speculation is stasis crypts. We know that the ships that they used to travel from their homeworld were fitted with stasis crypts, which enabled the Necrontyr to survive the long distances of travel that they would undertake in order to make it to their new homeworlds. Right. So we can assume that stasis crypts had something to do with their perception of time and making up for long distances of time where it wouldn't make sense for a Necrontyr to be able to survive. And the third point of speculation is habitable worlds. The Necrontyr likely landed on habitable worlds, and the environments on these worlds were beneficial to the well-being of the Necrontyr, such as having a sufficient atmosphere and oxygen, and having no stellar death rays or dying suns. These things could not reverse the damage done to the species on a genetic level. They still suffered from ulcers and cancers, which sentenced them to short lives. They were just not as short as they would have been if they had have stayed on their homeworld, and the quality of their lives improved greatly. So in regards to how long the expansion took, with the territories of the Necrontyr spread throughout the Milky Way galaxy, it likely took a really long time, especially since their ships did not have warp capabilities and quite literally slowly floated through space until they found a suitable home. However, because the Necrontyr were in stasis crypts, it was as if no time had passed for them. And this is what makes it possible that some Necrontyr characters can remember being mortal creatures before biotransference. It could very well be a possibility that the royal courts continued to use stasis crypts to extend their lives artificially and delay the development of ailments that would eventually kill them. It could have also been like after Necrodermis and these stasis crypts were created, it could have also been that they became a widely used thing, even on the Necrontyr homeworld. And so stasis crypts likely extended the lives of the Necrontyr artificially. But for those characters who could remember the expansion and the Wars of Succession, it's likely due to the fact that they started using stasis crypts as a normal aspect of Necrontyr culture. Something else that I wanted to go over was someone in one of the Facebook groups that I'm a part of asked the question, if the star of the Necrontyr homeworld was so fatal to the Necrontyr, then how could they have even evolved into a sentient species? And like I was able to give my theory that the star was not always like the lifespans were not always short. But then it made me think, if the lifespans were not always short and the Necrontyr were able to develop into a sentient species, then this must mean that the changes that happen in their system or to their world were caused by their star. And of course, we already know this because of the radiation. But what I mean is that what changed in their system, the changes that made it so that their lives began becoming short, was changes in their star. This change was likely that their star began to die. For life to exist on the Necrontyr homeworld, then that means that it had to exist in a habitable zone of their system, which is a zone around a star in which life could develop. Multiple things could have happened to the conditions on the world which would have made it fatal to them, but it most likely had to do with their star, because if it was, let's say, about their atmosphere thinning, then their trouble would have been that they had the inability to breathe. The ailments that the Necrontyr suffered, the cancers and the ulcers and the tumors, were caused by their star's radiation, which suggests to me two things. One, that their star was a red giant, and two, that it began to expand in its death throes, shifting the habitable zone outward. When red giants begin to die, they expand over billions of years until they collapse, in on themselves. This expansion likely created or increased the radiation rays on the Necrontyr planet, increasing the amount of ailments and leading to them having shorter lives. This theory of their star being a dying one is supported by the fact that their homeworld existed in the halo of stars at the edge of the galaxy, the halo stars being the oldest stars in our galaxy. So this kind of addresses how it was possible that the Necrontyr were able to come into existence as a species, and then also how they were able to acknowledge that their lives were getting shorter because their sun had begun to die over time, and when they became a sentient species is when it started to take its fatal effects, when the radiation rays started to increase, when the star began to expand, and the habitable zone began to shift. All right, so I think that is a kind of way of explaining this. Like they did not always have short lives. They were able to develop into an intelligent species, but by that time that they did, their star began to die. So, in my last video, I go over how the Necron form is practically necrodermis skin over necrodermis bone, but I also point out that the Necrontyr did not have shoulder crests that went above their heads. What I did not clarify in that video was that those necrodermis crests were necrodermis armor. The current Necron form is actually the combination of necrodermis skin, necrodermis bone, and necrodermis armor. Looking at the visage of the Necrons from that perspective, we have clues as to how the Necrontyr armor possibly looked, meaning they probably looked like they had flared shoulder pads, a rib cage-like armor over the abdomen to protect their vital organs, with their dynastic ankh in the middle, lion cloth-like plates, thigh armor, and so on and so on. The higher ranking the Necrontyr, the more elaborate and decorated their armor. Though this cannot be confirmed, the armor that the Necrontyr wore during the Wars of Succession and the early battles in the War in Heaven could have been made from necrodermis. The most iconic part of the Necrontyr armor was their mask, which I call their death mask. The face of the Necron is not the face of the Necrontyr. It's a war mask of the necrodermis, made of necrodermis armor. This is something that was obvious, but something that I didn't think about before, being that the Necrons were Xenos, I thought they might look exactly how the armor looked. And while this does not take away from my theory that the Necrontyr were a species that was organized by physiology, it does also provide an even deeper look into how the Necrons look now. So there was a physiological difference between the Necrontyr, but the armor that they wore was also different as well. Why was their armor shaped in the visage of a skeleton? Well, let's assume that all Necrontyr followed this standard of armor pattern before biotransference. In that case, it was a cultural tradition that dictated the style and the aesthetic of their armor. This is further backed by the Triarch Praetorians, whose role it was to preserve Necrontyr codes of war and ensure that these codes were being followed. So if the Praetorians were around during the time of the Wars of Succession, and this was the armor being used, then it must have been something that was sanctioned by the Triarch and something that is sanctioned by Necrontyr culture. But why? I very loosely speculate that the origin of the visage of their armor is sourced in their worship of their god, Azagorod. Now, before biotransference, Necrontyr warfare had to have been primarily close combat oriented because Goss weaponry didn't exist until after biotransference. The variety of bladed weaponry that the Necrontyr used can likely be seen in the weapons that they have now, which include war scythes and rods of command and axe-like weapons, which we are going to call flare blades, swords, and so on. During the Wars of Succession, the Necrontyr likely fought primarily close combat, clad in skeleton-styled metal armor and death masks. Those dynasties which excelled in close combat dominated during this time. Now, this isn't to suggest that they didn't have projectile weapons like the bow and arrow or some sort of equivalent to that, but most of the fighting was close combat. And upon realizing this, we have to think a little bit differently about the old ones. According to available information, the old ones were called such not because they were amongst the oldest species in the existence, but because they themselves were the oldest species in existence, and they spread throughout the galaxy or the Milky Way galaxy by the time the Necrontyr had began to expand. Multiple dynasties likely encountered the old ones in the variety of areas that they traveled to because they too lived on habitable worlds. The only difference is, and we're going to get into this later, the only difference is that the old ones likely created habitable worlds and the Necrontyr just discovered and settled on the habitable worlds that they found. It's often said that the old ones and the Necrontyr were both technologically advanced, but the old ones were even more technologically advanced than the Necrontyr. And at first I thought this meant that the old ones carried lasers and ray guns and wild sci-fi armor. But then I thought, these are still relatively primitive times in the 40k universe, so the forces of the old ones likely used relatively primitive weapons like blades as well. But their technological advancements most likely had to do with the warp in their mastery of the Immaterium, which gave them an upper hand during the early wars in heaven, and the Necrontyr were still flesh and blood creatures, or when they were still Necrontyr creatures. This is also why the Necrons had the upper hand after biotransference, because their own technology trumped the old one's technology. Overall, what I'm trying to get at here is that the wars of succession were likely fought using blades for the most part, not Gauss weaponry. And the first part of the war in heaven was fought between two forces who used bladed weaponry and had kind of primitive style armor. So I just wanted to change the narrative and the visualization of the beginning, the first war in heaven, the first war with the old ones, by stating that Gauss weaponry didn't exist. And so they likely fought each other close combat, and maybe with primitive forms of projectile weaponry, but nothing like death rays or anything like that. And as far as visualizing this, imagine the Tomb Kings from Warhammer Fantasy fighting the Lizard Men from Warhammer Fantasy. Right? Not literally, because we're going to go into that, but just imagine two close combat forces, one with the heavy Egyptian theme, and the other with the like a Aztec kind of theme, fighting each other. Okay, so let's get into the old ones. Who were the old ones? According to information that's available to us, the old ones were an ancient, technologically advanced species of Xenos that are described as cold-blooded reptilians. It is believed that they are the oldest species in the galaxy, amongst the first to come into sentience, and the first to establish an interstellar empire, meaning that they were the first species to become a void-faring species, sailing the quote-unquote Sea of Stars. They were described as technologically advanced, but as I said earlier, their technology was still primitive in design, though superior according to the standards at the time. What really made the old ones superior and advanced was the fact that they developed into a psychic species and were able to interact with the warp. It was the old ones who established the webway, which was essentially a system of warp tunnels which enabled them to travel extreme distances across the galaxy by merely stepping through a gateway into the webway and arriving at their destination a few seconds later. Now, an interesting piece of information I found is that the old ones were actually a benevolent and gentle and patient species who seeded many other worlds in the Milky Way galaxy with life and believed that all life had a purpose. According to available lore on the Old Ones encountered the Necrontyr while the Necrontyr were in the midst of their expansion into the wrecks of the galaxy. According to the sources, the Necrontyr asked for the technological means to achieve immortality and were denied by the Old Ones, and this is what led to the war in heaven. When we search for the old ones and we search for information on the old ones, we just type it in Google. One of the most common images is of a Warhammer Fantasy, now Warhammer Age of Sigmar, figure called a Slan Starmaster. Now, breaking the fourth wall here, most of us know that Warhammer 40k is just Warhammer Fantasy in a sci-fi setting. A lot of the races in 40k have an almost direct aesthetic correspondence to a race in Warhammer Fantasy. That's not to say that there's any kind of further implications of some sort of connection between the two universes narratively, only to say that GW reuses and repurposes its themes for the settings that they make, which is normal and to be expected. In fantasy, the Slann are a core species of the lizardmen race and were created by the ancient species known as the Old Ones. They were not physically intimidating, they looked toad-like in appearance, however, they could nonetheless wreak havoc with their psychic might. In regards to searching up the Old Ones in the 40k setting, another image pops up of a reptilian Xenos known as the Slann or the Old Slanni, who might be a devolved version of the Old Ones. The being has a flamer in its hand, which places it in the current lore because, like I said before, they didn't really have projectile weaponry, which makes sense because they are considered to be devolved Old Ones, and the Slann still exist in the modern setting for 40k. According to the lore, they have removed themselves from the affairs of the galaxy and have mostly retreated to a number of worlds to the north of the Milky Way galaxy. Their worlds are closed off to the variety of different species in the galaxy at the time, and they do not need much from others. There are also a number of primitive Slann civilizations throughout the Milky Way galaxy that still exist and use weaponry of their own primitive design, as well as weapons considered imperial, like the lasgun, the power fists, and the flamers. In information about the Slann, it also says that the Slann are said to have warned the Eldar about the creation of the warp gods due to their own nature. The Slann also consider themselves to be the oldest species and the first to come into existence or sentience. As said earlier, the Old Ones are said to be that. According to the information on the Slann, it was the Slann who seeded life throughout the galaxy, but according to information on the Old Ones, it says that the Old Ones were responsible for that. When comparing the lore between the Old Ones and the Slann, the similarities can lead one to think that the two groups, the Old Ones and the Slann, are one and the same. However, they are not. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to divide the Slann and the Old Ones into separate groups, okay? So I'm going to call the Old Ones the real Old Ones and the Slann as the mistaken Old Ones, right? So an important distinction between the real Old Ones and the Slann, which would be mistaken for the real Old Ones, is that the real Old Ones were a peaceful species that studied the mysteries of the universe and believed that all life was valuable, while the Slann were a warlike species. The lore itself speaks about the Slann and the Old Ones as if they are the same thing, because if we research two different things, if we research the Old Ones, we see that the Old Ones did this and this and this and this, and then if we research specifically the Slann, we see that the Slann did the exact same thing. So the lore itself speaks about the Old Ones and the Slann as if the Old Ones were the Slann. But there are certain aspects of the information that show that the Slann and the Old Ones were not the same thing. For example, the Slann were said to retire from an active role in galactic affairs, falling into a long dream of introspection. According to available information, they didn't seem to experience any physical conflict, with no records of destructive wars and disasters. They just retired from their affairs. Now, if we put this in the context of the Necron tier narrative, the Slann apparently retired before ever meeting the Necron tier. Yet, according to the lore for the Slann warned and interacted with the Eldar, whom they are said to have created. The Slann are said to have not experienced any conflict that made them retire, but according to the Eldar, the Necrons fought the Old Ones in the war in heaven. Now, the only way that this can make any kind of sense is if the true Old Ones were the Old Ones that retired onto the worlds in the galactic north of the Milky Way galaxy, and the Slan were who the Necrontyr encountered during the expansion and warred with in the War in Heaven. It is my theory and my speculation that the Old Ones created the Slan, who were the first species to come into sentience, who spread throughout the galaxy using the webway portals created by the Old Ones. Then the Old Ones retired as the Slan continued their work. They encountered the Necrontyr, who would ask for the technological means of immortality and would deny them that. The Slan would fight the Necrontyr after the Necrontyr declared war on them, and the Slan slaughtered the Necrontyr, forcing them back to their homeworld for thousands of years. Biotransference happens, and the tables turn on the Slan as they are slaughtered in droves. The Slan create the psychic species, which would eventually evolve and become able to combat the Necrons, but the Slan themselves had their numbers significantly reduced to the point where they were considered wiped out. The Slan were mistaken as the actual Old Ones, first because they actually looked similar. If you look at the miniatures for the Slan, the old Slan miniatures, they look like frogs. If you look at the old ones and you see the Slan Star Master pop up, it also looks like a frog, right? The Slan look frog-like and amphibious, hence the confusion between the Old Ones and the Slan. Plus, considering that the Old Ones retired before ever encountering the Necrontyr, no one had ever met the actual Old Ones except for the Slani, who were created by them directly. The Eldari called the Slan the Old Ones because it was the Slan that created the Eldar. Remember, it is through the Eldar writings that we have an account of the War in Heaven. So when they say the Old Ones, what they're really talking about is the Slan. Thus, the Necrontyr did not actually fight the real Old Ones. They fought the Slan. This theory bridges the gap between the old Slan and the current Slan that exists in the modern setting, and explains why they exist how they do, as almost Mesoamerican inspired primitive tribes spread throughout the galaxy without access to the webway or the actual Old Ones. They did not become primitive, they just stopped advancing after the War in Heaven. So if the Old Ones created the Slan as the first species to come into sentience, then why did the Old Ones create the Slan? My answer to that is perhaps to be their warlike equivalent, because they knew what the future entailed, mainly war. Returning to our earlier topic, knowing what we do now, how exactly did the Slan beat the Necrontyr to such a degree that they were forced back to their homeworld and stuck there for thousands of years? Especially since the weapons that they were using were just as primitive as the Necrontyr. It's concluded in the lore that psychic power gave them an upper hand, and it really did. The webway enabled them to basically shock assault the Necrontyr. But is there any information on how other technological means could have been applied? Yes, their armor. So in available lore for the Slan in the modern setting, the Slan wear armor that appears to be primitive, but actually provides them with an energy field protection called Displacer Field, or the armor being called Displacer Field armor, which is standard amongst the Slan. So along with their psychic powers and the webway, the Slan likely had the same armor, which gave them an invulnerable save and which would make them hard to kill in close combat. And so this is likely how the Slan were able to beat back the Necrontyr. They were able to pop up and assault the Necron, or shock assault the Necrontyr, and then their armor pretty much made them invulnerable to hits toward them, which is, I think, really cool. Okay, so in my research for the Old Ones, I found two really interesting bits of information that I think we should go over. The Old Ones were said to retreat to the worlds in the northern rim of the Milky Way galaxy. Now, as we have established previously, the Necron tier were also from the northern rim of the galaxy. This makes me question just how far did the Necron tier travel until they encountered the Slan, and whether or not they actually encountered the real Old Ones. I mean, due to closeness, perhaps the Necron tier did encounter the true Old Ones and possibly did wipe them out, being that they were a peaceful species. But the story is told from the Eldar perspective, and so there's no distinction between the true Old Ones and the Slan. What this means is that even though the Necrontyr would face the Slan and not really the Old Ones, it is quite possible that being that both the Old Ones and the Necrontyr were in the northern rim of the galaxy, that the Necrontyr could have wiped out the actual Old Ones, especially being that they are, or they were, a peaceful species, whereas the Slan were warlike. So it's a possibility that the Necrontyr actually did encounter the real Old Ones and wipe them out. Secondly, in my research for the Old Ones, it says that the lives of the Necrontyr were always short and painful due to the deadly radiation of their world's sun and their evolutionary adaptations to it. Now, when I read this line, I kept having to go back and forth between the information on the Necron and the information on the Old Ones, and this line of information is only available when you research the Old Ones. Now, this is really interesting. It says the evolutionary adaptations to it. This suggests that the Necrontyr did in fact adapt to the radiation of their world to some degree, but not in a way that made their lives better for them. According to modern science, humans can adapt to radiation. Prolonged exposure to low doses of radiation increases resistance to larger doses. So if we apply this to the Necrontyr, right? The Necrontyr come into existence on a world whose system's star is beginning to die and the levels of radiation are increasing slowly over billions of years. They actually adapted to these low levels of radiation to the point where they were able to endure larger doses of radiation. The problem is that at one point the radiation began too much, like it became too much for them to adapt to, and it started to kill them. If we really think about the implications of this, it basically concludes that the Necrontyr were screwed from the start. They evolved on a planet whose star began to expand. Thus, the rays of their sun's radiation increased over time. They had developed a resistance to these small doses and small increases in radiation, but by the time they evolved into a sentient species, their sun's rays began to kill them and shorten their lives. Now, the irony in this is that the same solar rays that shortened the lives of the Necrontyr by giving them various cancers could also kill the cancer cells that it gave them. So the rays that I'm talking about are the X-rays and gamma rays, which examples of such include cosmic rays, high energy electromagnetic radiation from the sun. Now, these rays are what is responsible for giving us, like humans, skin cancer, right? So we have sunscreen and things of that nature, right? But these rays, these X-rays and gamma rays, are also what is used as cancer treatment to kill cancer cells. So what I'm getting at here is that the same conditions which gave them cancer also killed the cancer that it gave them, right? And in the midst of this, it really just meant that their lives were shorter. However, when we take this into consideration and we take the fact that they expanded, meaning they left their home world, they actually screwed themselves over, because once they left their homeworld system and the star, they no longer had those powerful cancer-killing rays which allowed the cancer to spread. The Necrontyr lived the longest that they naturally could as a sentient species on their homeworld, and this supports the theory that they were never supposed to leave. By the time they became sentient, they had already adapted to the solar rays that were killing them. But that meant that they were never really supposed to live long lives. They were adapted to short lives. They were adapted to the lifespan that they were imbued with on their homeworld. Once they left that, the same X-rays, the same gamma rays that were giving them cancer, were no longer there to stop the cancer from spreading. It's just like, when you really think about it, it's messed up. They were never supposed to leave. They were actually always doomed to be a short-lived species eventually. Like, that's their highest point. They at one point lived long lives until the star's radiation increased dramatically, and it started to kill them and shorten their lives. Being that the Necrontyr species came into existence on a world whose system had a dying star, it means that they adapted to the increases in the doses of radiation over billions of years to the point where they become a sentient species. Something happened to their star where the radiation spiked, and it started to shorten their lifespans. Like, they began to live shorter lives. Now imagine if instead of leaving, they stayed on their homeworld. They would have adopted to higher levels of radiation. They could have become a species that was highly resistant to radiation, but they decided to leave when they realized that their lives were getting shorter because of the spike in radiation. And when they left, the cancer killing rays that they received from their sun were no longer there. So this actually allowed the cancers to kill them, thus keeping their lifespans short, which is just messed up. If they had have stayed on their homeworld, they could have lived longer. They could have adapted. Eventually, they could have evolved into a species that became extremely resistant to radiation. But because they left when they did, they actually just doomed themselves to having shorter lives. Imagine everything that they went through could have been avoided if they just had have stayed on their homeworld. But then again, maybe I am wrong. Because, like I said earlier, their star was dying. And if their star was a red star, eventually their star would expand to the point where it would engulf their homeworld. But at the same time, maybe before that, maybe it was going to take billions of years before that could happen. In between the time that the star was going to engulf the world, they could have adopted into a species that was highly resistant to radiation and could live longer lives because they were adapted to such high levels of radiation. Maybe they could have existed in places that humanity and other species could not have. Maybe they could have dominated the halo region of space where there are a bunch of dying stars because they could just take the radiation. But instead, they left their homeworld looking to live longer, when in reality, by leaving their homeworld, they actually cut their lives shorter. God damn. That's just messed up. Like, really, like, genuinely messed up. If they had have stayed on their homeworld, they would have been a stronger species. But because of their desire to live longer, they actually decreased their lifespans. And then everything else that happened after that happened. This is a bunch of craziness, really. Okay, so we're going to move to Azagorod, the Nightbringer, and the Satan and the Old Gods, right? Because I had gotten into a debate with someone online in one of the Facebook groups I'm a part of, and they posted something about the Necron tier star being eaten by a Satan, and I was like, no, that's an inaccurate interpretation of the lore. But when I did my research on the Satan, and specifically Azagorod, I found that I was wrong, and so I had to go back to that post and apologize and be like, hey, you were right? So here's the thing. We already went over how the Satan were not actually the old Necrontyr gods, but the primal energetic forces that the Necrontyr called Satan. They were put into necrodermis bodies that were made in the image of the old gods. We also went over how the Necrontyr began to worship these embodied images as their old gods because of the pure destructive power they possessed. We talked about how the Necrontyr gods were likely representative of natural forces rather than actual gods, and how if they were literal gods, the Necrontyr had the inability to interact with the warp and souls, which were too weak to make those gods an actual reality in the warp, like the Chaos gods. We talked about how gullible the Necrontyr were to think that they actually knew the nature of these cosmic beings that they were interacting with. But if we look at their situation from a certain standpoint, we can actually sympathize with their misunderstanding. They had finally seemed able to escape their homeworld and settle onto other worlds, meeting other new life forms that experienced a better quality of life than them. They meet the old ones who seem to have the powers of gods and ask them for the knowledge of how to live longer lives, but they were denied. The Necrontyr leaders declare war on the old ones, and it's a slaughter, as the Necrontyr people are pushed back to the very world they tried to escape. I can imagine that such an experience would bring the old Necrontyr faith back, especially amongst the lower status citizenry who would have asked for a truce between the Necrontyr and the old ones if they could. Now, a question that I had in my last video was whether or not the Necrontyr communicated with the Satan before the first half of the War in Heaven. The answer to that question I have found is no, but kinda. At one point in time, the Necrons were polytheistic and believed in multiple gods with one primary death god. This god was called Azagorod, the Nightbringer. He is referred to in ancient Necrontyr hieroglyphs, and he is primarily a destroyer who fed on the anguish of entire species, and by that they meant theirs. The Necrontyr meant their species, but they assumed that if they were being fed off of by Azagora, then other species might as well might be being fed off of Azagorad as well. It's like a cultural subjectivism where they think that because they're experiencing something, other species, if they exist, might be experiencing it as well. This is why the Necrontyr were so surprised that there were other life forms who were not dying like they were dying, right? As a representative force, Azagorod probably represented their sun and its destructive rays, which is ironic because their star was indeed being fed upon by a Satan. Now, the Necrontyr did not know this, and both parties were unaware of each other, and we don't truly know how long their star had been a prey to the Satan. But the connection between Azagorod, their sun, and the fact that their sun was indeed being fed upon is ironic. Eventually, the Necrontyr were able to detect the Satan around certain stars. When the Necrontyr made bodies of Necrodermis in the shape of the old Necrontyr gods, they created one in the image of Azagorod. It was the Satan of their homeworld's star that embodied it. Its nature matched with the nature of Azagorod, the Necrontyr god of death, and it slaughtered hundreds of Necrontyr the moment it was embodied just because it could, and it was only calmed by promises of servitude and submission. The Deceiver was another Satan which embodied the image of the Necrontyr god of Mephitran the Messenger, and so on and so on. But I just wanted to answer that question about whether or not the Satan ever communicated with the Necrontyr before the War in Heaven. The answer is no, but they were there. Both parties were just unaware of each other. From answering that question, though, another one came up. What made the Necrontyr notice the Satan only after they were being beaten back to their homeworld? Some of the lore says that the Necrons might have always detected the presence of the Satan around stars, even though they didn't know what they actually were. However, in that lore, it doesn't say that the Necrontyr looked toward their own star and realized its presence, which suggests to me that the presence or the Satan was not always feeding off of their star. What made the Necrontyr look at their star and question if something was happening to it? And when could this have happened? I theorize that there was a change in the radiation output of their star that made them look at their own star in curiosity. It's described in lore that the way the Satan fed on stars was that they wrapped themselves over the star and fed off the energy emitted from it. Perhaps when the Satan began feeding off of their star's rays had less of a fatal impact on the Necrontyr homeworld, and that aroused suspicion. When could this have happened? After the expansion, but before biotransference. As stated earlier, the Necrontyr homeworld was not abandoned and likely remained a seat of power to the Triarch and noble houses. Sometime after the expansion but before biotransference, a Satan would move to their star and begin to feed upon it. Thus, along with the Necrodermis and Stasis crypts, could have made the Necrontyr homeworld far more survivable than it was before. But then again, we went over the fact that the cancer creating rays were also cancer killing rays. So they actually began to live even shorter lives when they were beaten back to their homeworld, because there was literally a Satan feeding off of their star. And the Satan that was feeding off of their star would become Azagorod. It would embody the image of Azagorod, the Necrontyr god of death. Just irony all around. It's like the Necrontyr have a god called Azagorod, and it is represented by their son, right? And then eventually a Satan moves to their dying son and begins to feed off of it. Now this Satan is the one that would enter into the Necrodermis image of Azagorod. It's just ironic, like a full circle of like how art and culture become reality and vice versa, where this god, this Azagorod, became a reality. And it's just so interesting to think about. We don't know if the Necrontyr, if they had have ever stayed on their homeworld, we don't know if the Satan that was attracted to their dying star would have actually begun feeding on it. There's just so much that we don't know. But the possibility is that if they had have stayed on their homeworld, they would have lived longer. Who knows if the Satan that was feeding on their star would have still arrived. Maybe the action going on in the universe attracted the Satan to their star. It's just so much speculation, but overall, the Necrons just screwed themselves. Last but not least, I want to go over the Cryptex. The Cryptex are the most dangerous of the Necrons. Since the days of the Necrontyr, the Cryptex were behind the rapid technological innovation of the species, which would eventually see them as a dominant power in the Milky Way galaxy. It was the Cryptex who created Necrodermis, and I can say that with certainty because out of all the roles to exist in Necrontyr society, I do not think that the citizenry or the nobility would have cared or had the intelligence to create the substance. It was the scientists of the Necrontyr, the Cryptex, to create Necrodermis. This naturally means that it was the Cryptex who created the ships upon which the Necrontyr would sail the stars during the expansion to find other worlds to settle on. It was the Cryptex who created the stasis crypts in which the Necrontyr people were interred while taking this long journey. It was the Cryptex who maintained or created the maintenance machines and programs that would guide the ships to their destination. When the Satan were detected, it was the Cryptex who detected them. It was the Cryptex who used Necrodermis to make vessels from the cosmic powers known, or for the cosmic powers known as the Satan. It was the Cryptex who made the biotransference a reality and who created the Necron weaponry and war machines. It was the Cryptex who designed the Necron carapace to be indicative of status, who created the protocols for the tomb worlds during the Great Sleep. The Cryptex have a serious amount of influence and control over the Necron Empire, and yet they are only advisors to the royal court and part of a pan-galactic conclave of their own. A question that comes up when thinking about the Cryptex was, why do they have one eye? I came up with an explanation that it allows them to see through layers of reality. Cryptics have one eye and they're able to move through dimensions, and so do many other units that have one eye that are Necrons, such as the Death Marks. There seems to be a connection between being able to navigate through dimensions of reality and having that one eye. So I think that's why they have it. But overall, the Cryptics are the most dangerous Necrons in the Necron narrative and the Necron faction. And in the next video that I create about the Necron dynasties, there's one dynasty that is, because of this fact, the most powerful Necron dynasty. And to find that out, to find out what dynasty I'm talking about, you're going to have to watch the next video. But yeah, that pretty much finishes this video on the Necron Deep Dive Part 2. It just goes into how just bad, how messed up the Necron history really was. We go over the old ones and how they were mistaken as a Slan and how the Slan were a different species. But I think one of the most powerful things that we can take away from this video is the fact that the Necron tier should have never left their homeworld. If they had have stayed, the possibility of them adapting to higher levels of radiation would have been possible, and they would have never needed to become Necrons. The Necrons were just ill-fated altogether, and this is what I'm trying to get at in the video. Yeah, so that's the video for today. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And I will be following this video up with a video next week on going through the Necron dynasties. I find myself very curious about how far back we can trace the lineages of each of the existing Necron dynasties. There's also some speculations about certain dynasties, and there's current drama involving the dynasties that exist in the modern lore. And so I wanted to create a video going over that, and that video will be released, Emperor willing, next week. All right, so without anything else to say, Inquisitor Vaughn out. Remember, the Emperor protects and the future is successor.